In 1993, the murder of a black teenager in London changed Britain forever. His death would start a chain of events that would expose shocking issues in both the police and British society at large. This is the story of Stephen Lawrence. Stephen Lawrence was born in London in 1974 to Jamaican parents who had emigrated to the UK in the 1960s. The son of a carpenter and a special needs teacher, Lawrence grew up in Plumstead, Hunterseye, southeast London, as the eldest of three. During his teenage years, Lawrence excelled in running and competed in local competitions. As an 18-year-old, Lawrence was studying technology and physics and English language with the hopes of becoming an architect. On April 22, 1993, Stephen Lawrence spent the day at Blackheath Bluecoat School. After visiting shops in Lewisham, he headed to his uncle's house in Grove Park, where he played video games with his friend Duane Brooks. At around 10 p.m., they left to catch the bus home. Realizing their 286 bus would arrive late, they decided to switch to another route on Wellhall Road, arriving at the bus stop around 10:25 p.m. Stephen walked ahead to check for a bus while Duane stayed nearby. Moments later, Duane saw a group of 6 white youths crossing the road toward them.
Straight ahead of me is 12 o'clock where Stephen's standing. Then at 10 o'clock, I remember this group of white boys on the other side of the road shouting.
He heard one of them shout a racial slur before the group attacked Stephen in a completely unprovoked attack.
And I just saw this guy strike a downward blow, which I thought was a weapon.
The attackers surrounded Stephen, stabbing him twice, deep wounds that severed major arteries and punctured a lung. The attackers then fled as Stephen and Duane desperately tried to get away.
He wasn't running properly, he was running lopsided, and he kept saying to me, Duane, what's happened to me? What's happened to me?
Despite his injuries, Stephen managed to run 130 yards before collapsing. Duane shouted for him to escape, but it was too late. Stephen bled to death shortly after. An off-duty police officer stopped to help, covering Stephen with a blanket. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to Brooke General Hospital. By 11:05 p.m., Stephen was pronounced dead. The pathologist later noted that running such a distance with catastrophic injuries was a testament to Stephen's remarkable physical fitness. Stephen's tragic murder was shocking in itself, but the following investigation would reveal the extent of the racism still present in the British system at the time.
It showed you the racism from the police, not just the racist folks on the street.
Immediately after Stephen's murder, support poured in as people from all parts of society condemned the shocking attack. At the bus stop where Stephen Lawrence was killed, 3 witnesses described the attack as sudden and brief, but none could identify the suspects. In the days that followed, local residents began naming a group of 5 men linked to the crime. Anonymous tips pointed to Gary Dobson, brothers Neil and Jamie Acourt, Luke Knight and David Norris, members of a gang with a history of violent racism. Investigators later revealed that a woman who might have held crucial information had called police 3 times shortly after the murder, but never came forward again. Meanwhile, the suspect's criminal past painted a chilling picture. Just weeks before Lawrence's death, Dobson and Neil Acourt tried to stab a black teenager in a racist attack. Jamie Acourt was tied to multiple stabbings in the early 90s, including one that caused a victim's cardiac arrest. Other attacks around Eltham were also linked to this same group. Within 3 days of Stephen Lawrence's murder, police identified the prime suspects, yet no arrests were made for over 2 weeks. The suspected attackers were between 16 and 17 at the time, adding further complications to the investigation.
The strategy was not to arrest. There were juveniles. You had to handle juveniles very carefully, obviously.
Officers delayed searching the suspects' homes for 4 days, and Detective Superintendent Brian Whedon, leading the investigation, later admitted he didn't know arrests could be made on reasonable suspicion, a fundamental aspect of criminal law.
If it had been a white boy, they would have surrounded a black community. They would have arrested as many black boys as they could, and they would not stop until they get the killer.
On May 7th, 1993, Gary Dobson and the Acourt brothers were finally arrested, followed by David Norris 3 days later and Luke Knight on June 3rd. Neil Acourt and Luke Knight were charged with murder, but saw the charges dropped within weeks due to insufficient evidence.
2 teenagers accused of murdering the black schoolboy Stephen Lawrence have been released from custody after the Crown Prosecution Service ruled there was insufficient evidence against them.
A month after Stephen's death, Nelson Mandela met with his family to show his support, as Stephen's family continued to campaign for justice.
We are very used to this type of thing where life is regarded as cheap in South Africa.
In August 1993, the Metropolitan Police launched an internal review. But by April 1994, prosecutors announced there was still not enough evidence for further charges. The case hinged on Dwayne Brooks' identification of the suspects, but legal issues and procedural errors rendered it unreliable. In September 1994, Stephen Lawrence's family launched a private prosecution against 5 suspects. Jamie Accourt, Gary Dobson, and David Norris were among them. Without access to legal aid, they relied on donations and pro bono support from a prominent human rights lawyer and his team. Charges against Accourt and Norris were dropped before trial due to insufficient evidence. On April 23, 1996, the remaining 3 suspects were acquitted after the judge ruled that Dwayne Brooks' identification evidence was unreliable. The 5 accused attackers were later turned upon by the British press, and public support for their prosecution soon increased. More protesters soon began campaigning for justice for Lawrence and his family. In July 1997, the Home Secretary ordered an inquiry to examine the circumstances surrounding Lawrence's murder, known as the Macpherson Report, which was completed in February 1999.
I'm afraid this report does identify significant failings in the murder investigation.
It found that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, with deep-rooted biases affecting their handling of the Lawrence case and interactions with ethnic minorities. It identified major failures in the investigation, including mishandling of evidence and poor communication with the Lawrence family. The report called for reforms in police practices, better training on racism, and improved accountability. It also recommended lifting the double jeopardy rule in murder cases to allow retrials with new evidence. Finally, it highlighted the need for broader societal change to address racial inequalities in Britain at the time. Later, in 2002, David Norris and Neil Accourt were convicted and sentenced to prison for racially aggravated harassment following an incident involving a plainclothes black police officer, further adding to the frustration. In June 2006, a cold case review commenced, involving a full re-examination of the forensic evidence. Initially, this was held in secrecy and not publicized. However, in November 2007, police confirmed they were investigating new scientific evidence. Gary Dobson and David Norris were arrested and charged without publicity on the 8th of September 2010. It was later announced by the Crown Prosecution Service that the 2 would face trial for Lawrence's murder in light of new and substantial evidence. New scientific methods had revealed a microscopic stain of Lawrence's blood in Dobson's jacket, as well as fibers from Lawrence's clothing and his hairs found on Norris and Dobson's clothes. The case centered on the new forensic evidence and whether it demonstrated the defendant's involvement in the murder or was the result of later contamination due to police handling. On the 3rd of January 2012, after more than 8 hours of deliberation, Gary Dobson and David Norris were found guilty of Stephen Lawrence's murder. The following day, they were sentenced to the equivalent of a life sentence, with minimum terms of 15 years and 2 months for Dobson and 14 years and 3 months for Norris, shorter than the usual sentence because of their age at the time. The murder of Stephen Lawrence and the subsequent investigation led to significant legal and societal changes in the UK. Legally, the Macpherson Report highlighted the need for police reform, resulting in changes such as the recognition of institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police and the introduction of new policies for investigating hate crimes. The case also led to the repeal of the double jeopardy rule for murder cases, allowing retrials if new evidence emerged. Societally, the case sparked a wider conversation about race relations, highlighting deep racial inequalities in the criminal justice system and beyond. It prompted increased awareness and calls for greater accountability, diversity, and anti-racist training within public institutions. Thanks to the unyielding campaigning of Stephen's family and supporters, Stephen's death led to huge positive changes for minorities in Britain that remain to this day. Of her son, Doreen Lawrence once said, "Had he been given the chance to survive, maybe he would have been the one to bridge the gap between black and white, because he didn't distinguish between black or white. He saw people as people." Thanks for watching.